Hi guys, today we're going to do part 2 of our population ecology lecture. In this lecture, we're going to talk about how populations grow under certain conditions and what limits those population sizes. So let's start with exponential growth. You've probably heard of the word exponent in math class. That's a number to the power of something. And when you're looking at those kind of numbers, they grow very rapidly, and that's what a population does under exponential growth. So what conditions must be met? In order for a population to grow this rapidly, there has to be plenty of space so they're not on top of each other, an abundant amount of food to feed your growing population. You have to have very few predators that would keep your population in check, and little to no disease. If all of these factors for reproduction and growth are ideal, the population might grow exponentially. So let's talk about bacteria with this. Bacteria are really good at growing exponentially. So if you have a bacterium and it can reproduce every 20 minutes, and you start with one cell, but at the end of 20 minutes you have 2 cells, which isn't very impressive. But then at the end of the next 20 minutes, after 40 minutes have eclipsed, you have 4 cells. And then by the end of an hour, you're at 8. And still, this is not that eye-opening until you go the entire day, all right? If it doubles every 20 minutes, then by the end of the day, you will have 4.72 times 10 to the 21st cells. And all of a sudden, that number gets very, very large. So when we look at a graph of exponential growth, you'll notice that the population starts very small and then rapidly increases. This shape is called a J-shaped curve because it literally looks like a J. Okay? In reality, populations very rarely go through exponential growth for long. It might start that way, but then they start to have a limit on your resources. So your resources become scarce and waste will accumulate, and this will inhibit or limit your growth. All right, competition for these resources also intensifies their inability to continue to grow this way, because on top of competing with each other, they're also competing typically with other species as well. So these things that limit your population size are called limiting factors, all right? Any factor that restrains the growth of a population. And so your typical ones are space, food, water, all right? Those are the big ones. So what this gets us to is the carrying capacity of our ecosystem. All right, so exponential growth does not continue in natural populations for very long because of the limiting factors. The carrying capacity is the number of individuals in the environment that environment can sustain over a prolonged period of time without taxing the ecosystem. So at first, a population may appear to be experiencing exponential growth, but as the resources become more limited and less available, the growth of the population will slow down. All right? When you don't have enough food, you're not going to be able to produce as many offspring. So how will resources be limiting during the growth of the population? Well, if your population is growing, food will become more and more scarce as you compete. All right? There's only so many food sources, and just because your population is growing exponentially doesn't mean all the other organisms are growing exponentially along with you. All right? There may be water shortages. All right? You think about animals that live in the water, just the space they would take up. If you think about dry seasons, then water is scarce, and if populations are large, the water resources may be used up. Okay. A disease may be introduced into the population with large number of individuals. So think about where we are right now with the coronavirus. The reason why we're running school the way we are is to reduce the number of individuals so that we can spread you out. If we packed you all into the school together and one individual came in and had the coronavirus and we were all packed together, that disease would spread rapidly. By having you guys spread out the way we are, we can have somebody come in with the disease and it may not even potentially spread. All right? The population will also run out of space eventually. There's only so much habitat to go around, and the habitats in nature are already shrinking exponentially themselves. Right? Additionally, predators may be attracted to the rising prey populations. So as prey get larger, predators are going to come to hunt that prey, and that will then keep that population in check. So there will be increased competition between the members of the groups, competition for these limiting resources, food, water, space. All right, and the accumulation of waste leads to an increase in disease as well and poor health. All right, if you're packed together and the waste accumulates, then disease is going to ensue. So the overshoot in the graph over here, so if you look at the graph, we're growing exponentially in J-shaped, and we got higher than the blue line, which is actually where our carrying capacity is. If you go past your carrying capacity of your population, then you start to damage your ecosystem. All right? So the overshoot is when you go past the carrying capacity. Many members of the population will die or starve at this level. Starvation is quite common because when there's that many individuals fighting over food, they tend to overeat the vegetation and destroy the vegetation's ability to grow back. All right, and this will cause the population to then drop below carrying capacity, which is what we see here. It shoots up, and then a bunch die, and they're below, and then that gives the ecosystem a chance for the plants to come back, and then they reproduce and they go back up. And so it's never really a straight line at the top here. It's always an up and down of deaths versus births at the top of these graphs. The size of the population will fluctuate above and below the carrying capacity of the environment. So when you're trying to find your carrying capacity, you kind of eyeball these ups and downs and look for the average between the two. And that's probably where your population should be at. So when you reach your carrying capacity, the shape of your graph changes. It changes from a J shape to kind of a wonky little S shape. And this is called logistic growth. All right, logistic growth is when your population growth slows or stops following exponential growth because of limiting factors. All right, so a graph of logistic growth looks like a stretched out letter S. And as the population reaches the carrying capacity, the growth rate slows. It could even stop in some cases completely. And you may even get a population crash where the population drops very rapidly because all the resources have been decimated. So what kind of factors can affect our population growth and how different things travel through our population? We have these factors called density-dependent factors. These are factors that behave differently within a population based on how loosely or closely packed you are. All right, so the limiting factor only becomes limiting when the population density reaches a certain level, when they're closely packed together like the picture above. So it refers to the number of organisms per unit area, whatever that area is. So here with these penguins, they are very, very closely packed. And then we're going to talk about some of the things that would occur when you have a population that's closely packed like this. All right, these trees are also very densely packed. So density-dependent factors, limiting factors include competition. So looking at our penguins up here, they are going to be competing over space. They want their own individual space because they are a little bit territorial, but at the same time, they pack together to stay warm. So depending on what the weather is doing drives their behavior. But if they get too close, they will reach out and peck their neighbor. So they have to stay spaced enough that they're not within pecking range, but close enough that they're sharing body heat. And so this keeps them very densely packed. The trees here in this forest are densely packed because they're all competing for light. So there's competition for light in those organisms. Right? Predation also is density dependent. So if you imagine for a minute if you were in the school and everybody was gone but our particular class. All right, when our particular class can spread out through the whole school, and let's say I bring my pet lion to school and I let it loose. If you're spread out through the whole school, the lion doesn't have a very good chance of finding you and eating you. But if I trap you in a classroom and you pretend you can't get out, though I know you could, and if you're trapped in a classroom and I put my pet lion in there, your chances are not so good. So if you are in a densely packed population and a predator comes in, they're more likely to get a hold of you as a species rather than not be able to find you at all as a solitary organism. Parasitism and disease, so we kind of already talked about coronavirus and how that would work in a packed population. So if you picture these penguins, if one of these penguins has a disease that is transferable and they're tightly packed like that, you could see very easily how it would pass from one penguin to the next. Versus animals that are territorial and don't come in contact with each other, like tigers, for instance. They're not very likely to come in contact with another tiger unless it's mating season. And so if one has a disease, that disease is probably going to die with that individual tiger instead of spreading through the population. Shortages of food. If there's very little food and you're densely packed like this, there's going to be a lot of competition for that food. You're not going to be able to share it, versus if you're a solitary organism, you get what you find. And then shortage of nesting sites, of course. If you're densely packed like these guys, they are going to be competing over those nesting sites. So as a population becomes more and more crowded, organisms are going to have to compete over the basic necessities for life: food, water, sunlight in the case of plants, space to grow, and nesting sites. The more individuals that live in the population, the sooner they're going to use up the available resources, and then competition increases. The greater the population size, the more intense the competition. So how does predation play a role here? So a predator and the predator-prey relationship is the organism that feeds on the other organism, all right? And the prey in a predator-prey relationship is the organism that gets fed upon, all right? They're used as a food source. So in this scenario, my great white shark is the predator, and the seal that's sticking out of his mouth is the prey. So the predator-prey relationship is one of the best known methods of controlling the size of a population. When nature is in balance, the predators keep them in check, and the population oscillates back and forth. And so there's not a lot of problems. It's when we remove the predators from the food chain and food web that things start getting out of balance. So when we look at the graph to the right, notice an increase in the prey population. So the moose is the prey and the wolf is the predator. So if we look over here at this first lump here in the moose, so as the moose population increased, the wolves were low in numbers. But as these guys increased, shortly thereafter, you notice that the wolves increased and their population got quite high, because when they had a lot of food to eat, they could then reproduce more, but they had to wait till the moose were available, and then they started reproducing. So there's a lag time between the peaks, okay? So every time there's an increase in prey in our population, it's followed by an increase in predators shortly thereafter. As our predator population increases, so as we see our wolves get very high, you'll see then that our moose population starts to decrease, right? Because the wolves are eating them. And so this oscillation between predator-prey populations is what we see. The relationship controls the size of both populations, because as the wolves eat the moose and there's less of them, some of these wolves are going to starve and their population crashes down. Then as the moose population increases, we will eventually see the wolf population increase. So parasites and disease play a role in limiting population size as well. So if you are a parasite, you're any organism that feeds upon another living organism, very similar to a predator. The difference is that parasites need a host. And so the host is the organism they feed upon or live on in some cases, or even live in. So this is very similar to our predator-prey relationship. All right, it can also control the size of a population. So the parasite takes nourishment and nutrition from the host. Sometimes it can also spread disease, and the host is weakened and may eventually die, which lowers the population numbers. So there are other factors called density independent factors. These ones, it doesn't matter if you're densely packed or not, they affect you the same. So they tend to be the same in all populations, doesn't matter the size. And these are things that are typically associated with natural disasters. So they include unusual weather, all right, floods, fires, that we see a lot of in the United States lately, certain human activities such as damming a river, cutting down a forest, clear cutting a forest. Those things can also be density independent and are going to affect the population regardless of how loosely or densely packed they are.